I remember when I burned. I remember the roar, the glow, the tongues of flame that danced like prophets before the veil. I remember the scent of incense rising with every offering, every cry, every whispered hallelujah. I was not just a furnace, I was the keeper of sacred fire, the witness of covenant smoke. My stones were blackened, not with ash, but with memory. The priests came with their polished vessels, their solemn garments, their trembling hands. They tended me like a heart. They did not speak to me, yet I knew their burdens. I heard the confessions hidden in their silence, felt the weight of their hope with each ember they stirred. In those days, my flame was fed by devotion, by tradition, by a longing for the unseen. But time is a thief with soft footsteps. The songs faded, the footsteps grew fewer, the offerings became rote, weary, mechanical. Then one day, they stopped altogether. I do not remember the last flame. It did not go out with drama, it simply failed to return. I sat there, warm for a while, then cooling, then still. No one noticed, no one mourned. I became a vessel of ash, a relic with no voice. Dust layered over my edges like time pressing its thumbprint upon me. The priests passed me by. New ones came who did not know my name. They saw only a black pit, a thing to be cleaned or ignored. I, who had once burned with the prayers of a nation, became background. I wanted to rage, to crack my stones and demand attention. But fire without purpose is just destruction. So I kept still. Beneath the layers of soot, I remembered. I remembered the warmth, not just of heat, but of presence. There had been a presence, not always visible, not always spoken of, but felt in the silence between chants, in the hush that fell before the incense rose. I wondered if anyone else remembered, if they had felt the shiver that was not from cold, the tremor that had nothing to do with wind. I was not merely a fireplace. I had been a threshold, and now I was forgotten. Still, I watched, I listened. Even cold, even empty, I remained. Sometimes, in the deepest nights, I thought I felt a pulsy vibration in the stone, like something breathing far below. I told myself it was the echo of memory, nothing more. But memory can be a spark. Memory keeps a shape alive, even when all else collapses. I had no eyes, no voice, but I had soulies. Even a vessel of clay and stone can have soul, if it has burned with holy fire. So I waited, not with hope. Hope had burned out long ago. I waited with something else, call it ache, call it instinct, call it the residue of the sacred. There were rumors, muffled through the corridors, whispers from the outer courts. A rabbi from Nazareth, a man who spoke like thunder and healed like rain. They said he read the scrolls, and the scrolls read him back. They said his eyes held the desert and the sea. I did not believe, not because I could not, but because belief felt dangerous. What if I let myself believe and the flame never came? What if I reached for warmth and found only more ash? Better to remain still, better to be a cold truth than a deceived ember. But I could not stop the stirring. Something was shifting not around me, but inside. The ash was not just ash, it was waiting. I began to dream again, in my own way. Dreams not of fire, but of light, not of heat, but of warmth that did not sear. I remembered the stories how Elijah called down fire, how Moses saw a flame that did not consume. I remembered the first fire ever laid in me. A young priest, hands shaking, heart pounding. He had whispered a prayer, not to impress, not to perform, but to reach, and the flame had answered. It had leapt, it had lived. What if that flame could return? What if the fire of heaven did not care about cracked stone and forgotten names? What if it only waited for a soul ready to receive it again? And still I stayed, not from resignation, but from something older than fire faith without form. I could no longer glow, but I could remember the shape of heat. I could no longer smoke, but I could ache for the scent of offering. Around me, the temple changed. New voices echoed in its courts, curious, distracted, political. The rhythm was broken, but deeper, under the marble and the noise, something pulsed, not with power, but with expectancy, as if the stones themselves leaned forward, waiting not for a priest, not for a rite, but for a presence. And that was when I felt it, the breath. Not wind, not draft, but a breath. Soft as dust, but it stirred the ash. It stirred me. Something had entered. Not a person, not yet. A possibility. I felt the air thickening with purpose. I cannot describe it. You would not understand unless you, too, had been cold for centuries. Unless you had once held glory and then forgotten how it felt. But I remembered. So when the boy came, with eyes too quiet for his age, and he paused near me only for a second, I trembled. Not from heat, from recognition. He said nothing. He did not touch me. But his nearness broke something in me. A seal, a waiting. And the ash stirred again. If you had looked, you would have seen nothing. But I knew. Fire does not always declare itself with light. Sometimes it begins as a remembering. Sometimes it begins in the quietest place of all. I used to think I understood fire, that it was only flame visible, consuming, brilliant. But as I waited in stillness, something else began to stir in me. The fire I once knew had danced, but the fire I now sensed whispered. It did not burn upward, it deepened inward. In the temple's shadow, I became something new, not just a container of warmth, but a guardian of the ache for what had been lost. I started to notice the patterns again, shifts in light, as the sun passed overhead, the sound of sandals brushing stone. People came and went, but most never saw me. I was part of the furniture now, an artifact of a faith still spoken but rarely kindled. And yet, every now and then, someone paused near me. A hand lingered on the ledge. A sigh escaped lips too young to carry such weight. Once, a woman bent to touch the ashes, and though she recoiled, quickly perhaps shamed by her own longing, I felt the tremor in her fingertips. That tremor told me she remembered, too. Not me, not this lopsided basin of dust and soot, but the fire, the presence, the whisper beneath the words. I wondered if I had become a mirror of their emptiness, a place where longing could echo back unjudged. Not all came with reverence. Some mocked the stillness of the temple, turned sacred space into spectacle, tossed coins or insults with equal indifference. But even their noise could not drown the silence that lived beneath. The silence had become my closest companion. It was not absence. It was the weight of the unspoken, the breath before a word. And in that silence, I learned to listen for the divine, not in declarations but in delays. The priests no longer placed offerings in me, but once a child dropped a small bundle of herbs, giggling as if hiding a secret gift. The scent it released was faint, but I felt it. I felt it like a memory trying to wake. Perhaps heaven speaks more clearly to the smallest among us, or perhaps they are less afraid to hope. I remembered a prophet once cried, "Is not my word like fire?" And I trembled, because I no longer knew what word was waiting to be spoken, but I knew it was near, nearer than smoke, nearer than breath. Something in the world had shifted. The old rhythm of incense and chant had given way to something quieter, but more alive. I could not explain it, but I could feel it. It was as if the foundations of the earth were preparing for a new kind of fire, one that would not consume sacrifice, but hearts. And hearts, unlike logs or lambs, do not burn on command. They must choose to open, choose to ignite. And so I waited, not for hands to stir my ashes, but for hearts to turn toward the flame. One night, long after the temple gates had closed, I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, barefoot. He entered without ceremony, no torch, no offerings. He came alone. He sat in the shadows near me and said nothing, but silence bowed to him. I did not know his name then, only his stillness. He did not touch me. He did not even look my way. But the air around him thickened like it used to on holy days, like it did when the ark was opened, like it had when fire fell on Elijah's altar. His breath filled the space between us, and I felt my core remember the shape of flame. He exhaled slowly, and the ashes shifted. Only a little, but enough for me to know. He was not here to restart a fire. He was the fire, and that changed everything. In the days that followed, something inside me refused to settle. It was not a flame yet, but it was close, a trembling, an awakening, as if the ashes that had slept for years were now whispering in their sleep, not loud, not sudden, but insistent. The boy returned. I think he was the same one, older now, with quieter eyes. He brought with him no fanfare, no scrolls, no incense, just presence. He sat again, closer this time. His robe brushed the rim of my basin, and where the cloth touched, I felt warmth. Not heat, mind you, not like the old fires. This was gentler, but no less true. I do not know if he knew I was there, but I knew he was, and that was enough. People passed by him, some pausing, some scoffing. He did not answer their eyes. He seemed to listen for something deeper, something beyond their questions and masks, and then he began to speak not aloud, but into the quiet, into the very bones of the room. He said things no one else could hear, yet I heard every word, not with ears, but with stone, with memory. He spoke of light that no darkness could overcome, of truth not written in laws, but in love. He spoke of water that quenched thirst forever, and bread that filled not the stomach but the soul. And I burned, not with flame, but with recognition. These were not just teachings, they were fire and language, and every syllable stirred the embers buried deep within me. He left as quietly as he came, but the silence afterward was not empty. It rang with something new, like the pause before a storm, not of destruction, but of revelation. The next day, a group of children came. They played near the temple steps, their laughter echoing off the stones. One girl, barefoot and bright-eyed, skipped close to me. She stopped, stared, and reached into her satchel. From it, she pulled a small candle, already half melted, already used. She placed it inside my basin, gently, and then she smiled, not at me, but at something beyond me. I could not light it. I had no flame. But somehow, her act lit something else, something older than ritual, something deeper than ceremony, a faith that did not need fire to know it was warm. That night, I did not sleep. If stone can dream, I dreamed. Of burning bushes and tongues of fire, of voices calling in the wilderness, of nights pierced by stars. I dreamed of a fire not kept in altars, but carried in hearts. And I wept, yes. Even stone can weep if it has ever held something holy and then lost it. Or perhaps, if it knows what it lost is coming back. I had thought I would remain ash forever, that whatever glory had once flickered within me had lived its season and passed. But now, the stillness no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a threshold. Something was coming, not in smoke or in ceremonial chants, but in the ordinary, the overlooked, the humble, the unnoticed. I began to see differently. Not with eyes, for I had none, but with memory turned forward. Even the footsteps I once ignored became music. The wind that stirred my basin became breath. I waited not because I was empty, but because I was being readied. That readiness began to feel like worship. Day after day, the temple filled with noise, but here near me, the hush remained. Children sometimes sat close, whispering stories they half believed, stories of angels and stars and shepherds who had seen light. Old men shuffled past with eyes heavy from waiting too long, but their sighs warmed the stones. Even the doves seemed quieter, their cooing soft like prayer. Something was aligning, and though no fire had been relit in me, my ash no longer felt lifeless. It pulsed, not visibly, not yet, but I felt it. And then one day, he came again, older, steadier. His face was weathered not by age, but by love that had walked many miles. He stood still near the center of the temple, and people began to gather, not at once. They came slowly, as if drawn not by curiosity but by need. A woman weeping into her sleeves, a father holding a sick boy, a man whose shoulders bent with guilt, as if carrying unseen chains. He looked at each of them, and the air shifted. He said little, sometimes only a name, sometimes only silence. But in that silence, healing happened. Not like magic, not like spectacle, but like a door long closed being opened. They left changed. They did not cheer. They walked away slowly, as if still absorbing the weight of what had lifted. And I trembled again, not because he had touched me, but because I knew he had seen me. Not with his eyes, but with his knowing. He saw the ash, he saw the cold, and he did not pass by. That night, I waited again, but differently, not as a relic waiting for fire, but as a soul waiting for light. I began to believe that my waiting was not punishment. It was preparation. That perhaps ash is not death, but the fertile place where something deeper begins. I remembered a time when fire came suddenly, thunderously, but this was slower, gentler, and perhaps more real, because this fire was not about display. It was about indwelling, about presence. And presence does not shout, it stays. One evening, a priest stopped near me. He looked tired, his robe dusted with wear. He sat on the edge of my basin and sighed, not out of duty, but out of sorrow. And in his sigh, I heard something ancient, a groaning that stretched back through generations of longing. He did not light anything, he just sat. And I wept again. Not tears, of course, but the inward breaking of stone that remembers softness. I wished I could warm him. I wished I could tell him, it's not over. He left without speaking, but I believe he left changed. Something had passed between us, a communion deeper than words, and I began to think, what if this was my purpose all along? Not to blaze with fire that consumes, but to hold space for a fire that transforms. What if the truest flames are those that do not burn bodies, but change hearts? Then the boy returned. Not a boy now, a man, and with him, noise followed, priests with questions, people with shouts. The air turned sharp. He stood among them, still as ever, unmoving in the storm of argument. They asked for signs, for proof. He said nothing for a long time. Then he turned not to them, but to me, just a glance. And in that glance, I remembered the fire from the beginning, the one that was not kindled by human hands, the one that fell from heaven, uninvited, undeserved. That glance told me everything. It is returning, not in me, perhaps, not as flame, but as presence, as a light too holy to be captured, but never again far away. That night, the temple felt quieter than ever. Even the oil lamps flickered as if holding their breath. I could not sleep, not now. I had no flame to offer, no incense to rise, but I had something else: awareness, a stillness that leaned forward. I waited for nothing in particular, yet everything felt near. In that long hush, I remembered another Talione older than even this temple, a bush, burning but not consumed, a voice calling from the fire. I used to wonder why the fire did not destroy it. Now I know. Some flames are not meant to consume, they are meant to call, to consecrate. And now I felt that call again, not to be ignited, but to be ready. I no longer feared the ash, it had become sacred, not because of what it lacked, but because of what it remembered, and perhaps because of what it still dared to hope. They said Messiah would come with fire, but perhaps they were wrong about what that fire would look like. It would not be flames leaping from altar stones. It would be compassion strong enough to melt pride, mercy wide enough to absorb sin, a love hot enough to warm the coldest ash. I began to believe I had not failed in losing my fire. I had simply been called to carry its memory, to keep watch, even in cooling, to be a silent witness, waiting not for light to fall from heaven, but for heaven to bend low, step into the dark, and whisper, I am here. And so I waited, not with fear, but with reverence, because something had begun that could not be undone. Not even by centuries of silence, not even by all the cold stones of all the forgotten altars in all the world. There was a day unlike any other. I remember not because of fire, but because of the weight in the air. It was morning, though the light seemed dimmer, and the temple was alive with voices, but not with joy. I heard words I had not heard in years, words of accusation, of blasphemy, of verdicts passed in haste. Somewhere, a trial had ended. Somewhere, a sentence had begun. The crowd was restless, not like before, not curious, angry, afraid, expectant, the kind of expectation that precedes something breaking. I had no eyes to see what they saw, but I felt the tremor in their steps, the heat in their silence. And then I heard the footsteps. She's no longer alone. He was surrounded, guarded, pushed, not like before. The presence was still there, yes, but now wrapped in weariness, in ache. He passed near me, not as close as before, but enough for the ash to stir, enough for me to know. The fire was still within him, hidden now, dying, number never dying, but dimmed, voluntarily. There was pain in the way he moved, pain in the way others looked away, but still, he walked. Still, he carried. They took him beyond the temple gates. I do not know where, but I felt the earth pause. Even the wind held its breath. For hours, the temple became strangely silent. Not empty people still moved, but no one spoke above a whisper. The priests walked faster, their faces drawn. Something had shifted, and then it came. The cry, a sound like tearing. Not human, not thunder. Something older. The curtain, yes, I felt it. I did not see it fall, but I knew. The great veil, the one that separated the holy from the rest, it had been torn, not by hands, by something deeper, a rending not of cloth, but of separation itself. I felt the wind change, not a storm, a release, as if the air itself had been holding a breath for centuries, and now it was free to exhale. And in that exhale, my ash warmed, only slightly, not a flame, not even a glow, but warmth, the kind that sinks deep, the kind that speaks without words. It is finished. I knew what had happened without knowing the details. The fire had passed through death, not extinguished, transformed. He had gone into the coldest place and kindled it, and in doing so, had brought fire back to where it had never been. Even the stones of the temple seemed to pulse. I was not alone in remembering. The earth itself responded. Cracks echoed through the foundation. People screamed, and then it was quiet again, but not the old silence. This was a silence full of awe, of something too holy for words. I waited. I did not know what would come next, but I knew nothing would ever be the same. Not for me, not for the world. That evening, two men passed by, whispering. They spoke of the one who had died. They said he had spoken forgiveness as they crucified him. They said the sky had darkened. One of them cried as he spoke, not with despair, with recognition. Truly, he was the Son of God, he said. And I trembled, not from fear, from confirmation. Everything I had remembered, everything I had hoped was true. The fire had come, not in spectacle, but in sacrifice. Not to consume, but to redeem. And in that redemption, I had been seen. Even I, a cold vessel of forgotten ash, had been part of the story. He had looked at me. He had passed by me. He had breathed near me, and that was enough. I did not burn again, not like before. But my purpose had never been fire. My purpose had been to wait, to witness, to remember, and now, to believe. That night, the stars felt closer. Even the ash within me shimmered with something unseen, not heat, but hope, a hope that would never again be extinguished. For the fire had gone into death and come out alive, and that fire now lived not in altars, but in hearts. The next morning was strangely bright, not the usual shimmer of sunrise over limestone, but a clarity, as if the light itself had been washed clean. The temple returned to its rhythm, prayers, footsteps, rituals, but none of it felt the same. The veil was gone. They tried to stitch it back. They tried to go on as before, but something was missing, and everyone knew. Not missing, perhaps, moved beyond the confines of curtains and walls. I heard rumors. He had been buried. A tomb sealed with stone, soldiers placed to guard what should have stayed still, but tombs do not hold fire. They can hold ash, but not fire. 3 days passed. I counted them not by sun, but by silence, the kind of silence that deepens instead of dulls. And on the third day, everything changed. The temple was buzzing. Whispers turned to declarations. The tomb is empty, they said. He has risen. Some laughed, some ran, some wept. But the truth pulsed like heartbeat. He had returned, not as ghost, not as memory, as flesh, as presence. The same breath that once stirred my ashes now walked among them again, and I burned not visibly, not for show, but within. I knew, every grain of ash within me knew, resurrection was not a myth. It was the final flame, the true fire, and this fire was no longer confined to places like me. It moved in people now, in those who believed, in those who dared to hope. I remained in the temple, but I no longer felt alone. Every now and then, someone would sit near me and speak of him. They did not know who I was. They did not know what I had witnessed. But I listened, and I glowed not in ember, but in memory. And that memory became a kind of warmth, a kind of invitation for those who sat near long enough, who let silence speak, who dared to remember they would rise, changed, not all, but enough. And so, even though I was never relit, I never again felt extinguished, because resurrection did not demand fire, it only asked for readiness. And I, an old basin of ash, had been ready. I had waited, and the fire had come, not to burn me up, but to burn through me, forever. Time moved on, but I remained. The temple changed with the seasons, with the rulers, with the tides of power and silence. Stones shifted, priests aged, new chants filled the air, but I was still there. I no longer longed to be reignited. That desire had burned out long ago, not in despair, but in peace. I had seen what I was meant to see. I had heard the word made flesh breathe near my ashes. What more could I crave? Yet even as I accepted my stillness, I noticed something growing in the spaces others thought forgotten. Not fire, not smoke, but presence. And presence lingers. Presence infects absence with longing. Those who sat near me changed, not dramatically, but deeply. Some came to pray, some came to cry, some just came to sit in silence, as if the echo of his nearness still clung to my stones. And perhaps it did. I had no words to speak, no visions to offer, but I had memory. And sometimes, memory is enough to kindle faith, especially in those who have none left. One afternoon, a young man sat beside me with his head in his hands. His robes were simple, his feet calloused. He did not speak, he only wept, and I wept with him, not visibly, but in solidarity. I had once held sacrifice. I had once glowed with offering, and now I held his grief. And it was no less holy. They think holiness comes in grandeur, in thunder, in fire falling from the sky. But I had learned holiness comes in silence, in the willingness to stay, to endure, to remain present even when no miracle arrives. I began to think of myself not as an altar, but as a keeper of stillness, a vessel of memory, an echo of a gaze that had changed everything, and others felt it. I could not explain how, but they did. A widow laid a single olive branch in my basin. A child hummed a tune his mother had sung of Messiah. Once, a Roman soldier knelt not in ritual, not in duty, but in something raw. He whispered words he had no language for, and left different. I felt it. The fire had left its mark on me, not in flame, but in meaning, and meaning, once given by love, never leaves. I watched as news of him spread, not through scribes or decrees, but through lives. Broken lives made whole, frightened hearts made bold. Men who had once fled now stood and spoke. Women once silenced now sang aloud. They said he walked again, ate with them, touched their wounds. Then one day he was gone again. Taken, they said, lifted beyond sight, but not beyond reach, because even in his leaving, something of him stayed, not in temples, in them, and they began to live as if he had never left. That was the miracle. Not that he returned from death, but that he returned to them, through them, with them. And I, an old forgotten basin, had been part of the beginning. I had been there. I had kept watch, not as a prophet, not as a sign, but as a witness. And in a world that forgets so quickly, a witness is sacred. I no longer needed fire. I had become what fire points to: memory, faith, presence. Time was no longer counted in festivals or feasts, but in stories. Stories of what he had done, who he had touched, how he had looked at people. That look at was what changed everything. I remembered it, though I had no eyes. It had landed on me not in pity, but in knowing, in seeing. And those he called, those he healed, they carried that same look within them, like the fire had passed into their gaze, into their gestures, into the way they spoke his namino as title, but as breath. Yeshua, the one who saves. Not from armies, not from hunger, but from the deeper fireless void, from despair. I began to feel less like ash and more like soil, as if the loss I had carried for so long was not death, but ground. Ground waiting for something to grow. And it did grow. The stories spread beyond the temple, beyond Jerusalem, to lands I had never imagined. I heard names: Peter, Mary, Thomas, Paul. Names that once meant little now rang like bells, each one carrying a piece of the flame, not in their hands, but in their lives. They spoke not with authority, but with testimony. They had seen him, touched him, known him, and now they bore his fire. And I realized I had held something sacred, yes, but they had become sacred, living altars, walking temples. The fire that once lived in rituals now walked in sandals, now wept and sang and broke bread, now healed the sick and embraced the unclean. And too had not been forgotten. I had been remembered in the way that matters most, folded into the story, not for what I could do, but for what I had witnessed. I began to imagine the day they would no longer come, the day the temple itself would fall, stones shattered, walls breached, and I would be broken with it. But that thought did not bring sorrow, because the temple was no longer the center. He was, and he could not fall. His presence had moved on, into them, into every act of love done in his name, every cup of water, every word of grace. And if one day my stones were scattered to the wind, I knew they would still carry the scent of incense, the memory of presence. I was not afraid. I had been used, not abused, used for glory. And there is no higher calling for a vessel than to have once held the divine, not just in fire, but in waiting, in silence, in watching, and even in breaking. I would remain his. Because once touched by the fire that is love, even ash is holy. It was not the breaking that surprised, mate was the quiet that followed. When the temple fell, it did not scream, it sighed, as if all its strength, its prayers, its centuries of incense had finally exhaled. Stones groaned, pillars buckled, but there was no rage in their ruin, only release. I fell with them, not far, just enough to crack, enough to know the end had come. But it did not feel like death. It felt like being laid down, like an old soldier finally setting down his shield. Dust filled the air, voices cried out, and then silence, a silence unlike the others. This one did not wait for fire. It waited for memory, for meaning. I had thought I would vanish in dust, that wind would scatter my ash, and time would forget me. But even in brokenness, I remained. They did not come anymore, not in robes, not with chance. But sometimes, in the early dawn, footsteps crunched over rubble. A child, a stranger, a pilgrim who had heard stories and came to see where the fire once was. They would find a piece of stone, blackened, scarred. They would touch it gently. Some would cry, others would smile. And in that moment, I was not forgotten, not truly, because I was no longer a place. I had become part of a story, and stories, once born of truth, do not die. They move, they shape, they breathe. I was not the fire, I was only its cradle. But oh, what fire it had been. I remembered him, the way he walked, the way he listened, the weight of his silence, the spark in his nearness. Those moments had shaped me more than centuries of offerings. I had held no sacrifice greater than his presence, and even in ruin, I burned with that knowing. Once, a woman knelt where I had fallen. She gathered a handful of ash and whispered, "You were here, weren't you?" And I longed to answer, to say, "Yes, child." He passed by me. He breathed near me, and I have never been the same. I wonder what she did with that ash. Perhaps she kept it. Perhaps she let it fall through her fingers like sand. But even if she left with nothing in her hands, she carried something. Memory, touch, connection. That is what fire does. It changes the thing it touches. And I, though broken, was still marked by flame, still holy, still his. I do not know how long I lay among the stones. Time passed differently after the temple fell. There were no seasons to mark, no feasts to anchor the year, only sky and stars and silence. But then, one day, someone sang, a song I hadn't heard in generations, a song of promise, of return, of a light no darkness could overcome. It came from the lips of a girl too young to remember the temple, too innocent to grasp loss. And yet, she sang, and her voice echoed in the hollow where my basin had once stood. and I believed, not in the rebuilding of walls, but in the rebuilding of hearts. He had not come to save a building. He had come to make every soul a dwelling place. And maybe that is why I had cracked, so others might finally see that holiness was never meant to stay contained. That fire was always meant to spread, not in destruction but in devotion, in love. And so I waited, even in ruin, because waiting is not wasted when it is full of faith. Others came, quiet ones. They did not speak the old blessings, but they walked slowly, with reverence, as if aware they were treading on memory. One man bent low and picked up a shard of stone. He pressed it to his forehead, not in superstition, but as though seeking to draw out its story. I wished I could have told him everything of the boy who watched the flame, of the man who breathed life into silence, of the cry that split the curtain, of the glance that carried eternity. But stone does not speak, it remembers, and sometimes that is enough. Years passed. The temple ruins grew wild. Vines crept over fallen walls. Birds nested where choirs once sang. The air no longer smelled of incense, but of earth and wind. And still, people came, not in procession, not in ritual, but in hunger, in hope. They came looking not for me, but for him. And somehow, they found both. Not always in the way they expected. Sometimes in a single stone warmed by sun, sometimes in a silence that held more than words. Sometimes in tears they did not know why they cried. I knew, I always knew, because I had once been full, I had once been empty, I had once been seen, and now, even shattered, I remained a threshold, not to a place, to a presence. Once, a group of travelers gathered at sunset. One opened a scroll. He read not from Leviticus, but from a letter written by one who had seen the risen one. The words washed over us like light. Do you not know you are temples of the Holy Spirit? And I felt it something within me lifting, not physically, spiritually. My stone did not move, but my meaning did. I was no longer alone. I was everywhere. In every place a heart opened, in every soul that dared to believe. I no longer waited for fire to descend. It had already spread. It lived now in their eyes, in their prayers, in their sacrifices of love. And I, an old broken basin, was no longer needed. But I was never forgotten, and that is enough, more than enough. That is grace. It has been centuries, and yet, I remember. I am not sure how memory survives in stone, or in dust, or in what little remains of form once sacred. But it does. I remember not just what was done, but who came. I remember the breath of holiness, not as sound, but as shift as the subtle change in atmosphere when presence draws near. No one tells my story anymore. They tell his, as they should. But even in the telling, I live on. For every time a child listens to that story and wonders where it happened, what it felt like, whether the air truly thickened when he passed by, then I am there. I am remembered, not as relic, but as whisper, a trace of where he once walked, where fire once bowed in silence. I've heard them say, the world is colder now. That faith flickers, that noise drowns the holy. But I know different. I have lived through silences deeper than doubt. I have endured the fall of temples and the scattering of saints, and I have learned fire does not always roar. Sometimes it rests. Sometimes it waits in the marrow of things, in the cracked stones, in the eyes of widows, in bread broken among strangers. The fire lives still, and I am not gone. I am part of its story. There are moments, rare and holy, when someone touches a stone and prays, not to the stone, but with it, through it, as if it, too, is lifting its silent voice to heaven. I have been that stone. I have felt the trembling of hands unsure of faith, the weight of questions too heavy for words, and in those moments, I do not answer. I witness. I become again what I was made to be, not altar, but invitation, a space not filled with fire, but ready for it. I remember when they called him Emmanuel, God with us. That name has stayed with me, because I knew it was true not in creed, but in nearness. He was with us, not above, not beyond, with, and that changed everything. I remember the first time I knew it, really knew it, not when he spoke, but when he was silent near me. That silence shook me more than flame. It meant I had been seen, touched, known. And now, as I lie hidden in the foundations of time, I carry that knowing. It is not diminished by years, it deepens, because time does not erase encounter, it ripens it. The older the memory, the richer the echo. And mine is full of echoes, of sandals brushing stone, of a child's laughter, of a widow's weeping, of a presence that does not leave. I think of the places now where fire dwells not in altars, but in hearts, in prisons where prayers rise, in kitchens where bread is broken in His name, in fields where workers hum His songs. He is no longer confined to sacred spaces. He is the sacred in all spaces. That is the miracle. That is the fire that cannot be extinguished. And yet, I am still here, a remnant, a remembrancer, not because I hold any power, but because I held the beginning, because I once stood still when He walked by, because I did not speak when He was silent, because I remembered. And now, when someone needs to know that memory is holy, they find me. Maybe not in stone, maybe not in name, but in the knowing that something long ago burned and was not lost. They feel it when they light a candle and find their hearts stilled, when they kneel with no words and feel Him close. That is the flame I once held, not to keep, to pass on. There is a song I heard once, hummed by a grandmother to a babe. It spoke of rivers and rest, of mercy and mourning. The child slept, the woman wept, and I knew fire had passed there. Not visibly, but surely. I am not in that song, but I helped make the world where it could be sung. That is enough. I no longer ask to be remembered. I ask to be part of the remembering, because when He is remembered, so is all that He touched. And I, old vessel of ash, cracked and buried, am among them. The flame passed here, the fire lived here, the word walked near, and still does. That is what I would tell them. If stone could speak, that fire still lives. Not in spectacle, in surrender. Not in fury, in faith. Not in grandeur, in grace. And if ever they doubt, let them sit with silence. Let them wait with the broken. Let them remember the story, and they will find the fire again, not in me, but because of me, because I waited, because I remembered, because He came. I heard once from a pilgrim passing through that there is a church far away, built not of grandeur but of gathered stones, stones like me, from places touched by Him, some blackened, some smooth, all marked by time and reverence. I imagine myself there, not as center, but as corner, holding weight quietly, bearing witness silently. And I smiled if stone can smile, because it meant the story continued, not just in scriptures, but in structure, in community, in communion. Where 2 or 3 gather, they say, He is there. Then I am there too, for I am part of the gathering, part of the remembering. And what else is holiness if not that? To remember well, to carry truth not as weapon but as welcome. So I remain, even when unseen, beneath soil, beneath story, beneath the hum of new believers learning to listen. I am there, not for glory, but for grounding, because every fire needs something to burn in, and once, long ago, I was that something. That is enough for me, more than enough. There is a sound that comes before prayer, not words, not chants, but breath. The long, slow inhale of a soul preparing to speak the unspeakable. I have heard that sound more times than I can count. It is the sound that filled me once, when pilgrims gathered. It is the sound that lingers still, in churches and bedrooms and hospital rooms and places where hope hangs by a thread. It is the sound that tells me the fire has never left. That presence still dwells. I am not what I was. I am not even whole. But I am still listening. They no longer call me holy. They no longer bring offerings to lay in my basin. But when someone kneels anywhere with longing, I feel it. I recognize it. It is the same longing that once hovered over my ashes. It is the longing for Him, for Emmanuel, for the one who did not stay distant, who did not flee the dust, who did not despise the ash. He came near, and every time someone calls His namano always aloud, sometimes only with tears, I know He comes near again. That is what fire does. It returns, not always visibly, sometimes only in warmth, in clarity, in the courage to hope again. But it returns, and I have learned that holiness was never about being seen, it was about being ready. And I am ready, always, even now, even after centuries. I wait, not for fire from heaven, but for the next soul who dares to believe he is near. They do not know me, but I know them. I know the weight in their shoulders, the trembling in their hands, the ache behind their silence, and I wait with them. Because that is what I was made for. Not to shine, to stay, to remain where presence has passed, and to whisper without sound that he is still here, he is still listening, he is still enough. I think of those who carry his light now not with torches, but with tenderness. They walk into rooms heavy with sorrow and stay. They bring bread to the hungry, not just for the body, but for the heart. They tell stories of him not with certainty, but with awe, as if still surprised that grace chose to dwell among us. These are my kin. They are not priests in the old sense. They are fire bearers in the truest. I do not need to see them to know them. I feel them in the shift of things, in the sudden stillness when truth is spoken, in the hush that falls over grief when love enters quietly. And I am there, not because I deserve to be, but because I once stood where he walked, because I once waited where he prayed, because I once held the silence after his voice. They come with their questions now not to me, but to the silence I carry. They come with doubt, with anger, with yearning, and I do not answer. But I do not leave, and somehow that is answer enough. I think the holiest places now are not temples or towers, but tables. Tables where strangers are welcomed, where forgiveness is practiced, where laughter breaks open wounds and begins to heal them. I remember him at tables. He made them sacred. He still does. Every time bread is broken with love, fire flickers anew. Not the fire that burns, the fire that binds, that melts fear, that reveals truth, that calls even the most forgotten vessel like Maholi. And I suppose that is the greatest miracle. Not that he once passed by, but that he never truly left. That even now, as stones fade and memory thins, his presence remains. That even when no one says my name, I am not erased. I am included in him. I am held in the arms of the story he told with his life, with his death, with his rising. And every time someone chooses to love instead of hate, to stay instead of flee, to forgive instead of wound me, ashes stir. My silence hums, my cracked form glows, and I know, again, that I was not built for fire. I was built to remember it, and I always will. There is a field now, where once the outer court stood. Children run there, unaware of the prayers once whispered beneath their feet. Birds sing where choirs once echoed. And I do not mourn this, I celebrate it, because life has returned. Not the same life, new life, and that, too, is holy. I heard a woman tell her son, "This is where they say he walked," and the child looked around, puzzled. "But there's nothing here," he said, and she smiled. "There doesn't have to be," she answered. "He still walks." And I felt it then. The wind shifted. The ground remembered. Not because of me, because of him. Because he does not need stone to be present. He needs hearts, willing hearts, waiting hearts. And every time a heart cracks open with trust, I feel as if I've been made new. That's the secret the temple never fully grasped. That holiness was never about boundaries, but about becoming. Becoming a place where love dwells, where mercy lingers, where wounds are welcomed, not hidden. And if even one soul can become such a place, then the fire has not gone out. It has done what fire must do: move, spread, transform. I am not jealous, I am grateful, because I was once its vessel, and now I am its witness, and I will be, for as long as memory breathes. There is a sound that comes before prayer, not words, not chants, but breath. The long, slow inhale of a soul preparing to speak the unspeakable. I have heard that sound more times than I can count. It is the sound that filled me once when pilgrims gathered. It is the sound that lingers still in churches and bedrooms and hospital rooms and places where hope hangs by a thread. It is the sound that tells me the fire has never left. That presence still dwells. I am not what I was. I am not even whole. but I am still listening. They no longer call me holy. They no longer bring offerings to lay in my basin. But when someone kneels anywhere with longing, I feel it. I recognize it. It is the same longing that once hovered over my ashes. It is the longing for him, for Emmanuel, for the one who did not stay distant, who did not flee the dust, who did not despise the ash. He came near, and every time someone calls his name not always aloud, sometimes only with tears, I know he comes near again. That is what fire does. It returns, not always visibly, sometimes only in warmth, in clarity, in the courage to hope again. But it returns. And I have learned that holiness was never about being seen. It was about being ready, and I am ready. Always. Even now. Even after centuries. I wait, not for fire from heaven, but for the next soul who dares to believe he is near. They do not know me, but I know them. I know the weight in their shoulders, the trembling in their hands, the ache behind their silence, and I wait with them, because that is what I was made for, not to shine, to stay, to remain where presence has passed, and to whisper without sound that he is still here, he is still listening, he is still enough. I think of those who carry his light now not with torches, but with tenderness. They walk into rooms heavy with sorrow and stay. They bring bread to the hungry, not just for the body, but for the heart. They tell stories of him not with certainty, but with awe, as if still surprised that grace chose to dwell among us. These are my kin. They are not priests in the old sense. They are fire-bearers in the truest. I do not need to see them to know them. I feel them in the shift of things, in the sudden stillness when truth is spoken, in the hush that falls over grief when love enters quietly. And I am there, not because I deserve to be, but because I once stood where he walked, because I once waited where he prayed, because I once held the silence after his voice. They come with their questions now not to me, but to the silence I carry. They come with doubt, with anger, with yearning, and I do not answer. But I do not leave, and somehow that is answer enough. I think the holiest places now are not temples or towers, but tables. Tables where strangers are welcomed, where forgiveness is practiced, where laughter breaks open wounds and begins to heal them. I remember him at tables. He made them sacred. He still does. Every time bread is broken with love, fire flickers anew, not the fire that burns. The fire that binds, that melts fear, that reveals truth, that calls even the most forgotten vessel like holy. And I suppose that is the greatest miracle. Not that he once passed by, but that he never truly left. That even now, as stones fade and memory thins, his presence remains. That even when no one says my name, I am not erased, I am included in him. I am held in the arms of the story he told with his life, with his death, with his rising. And every time someone chooses to love instead of hate, to stay instead of flee, to forgive instead of wound me, ashes stir. My silence hums, my cracked form glows. And I know, again, that I was not built for fire. I was built to remember it, and I always will. Once, a child asked her grandfather where Jesus lived. The old man smiled and pointed to her chest. She didn't understand, but years later, when she cried for the first time without knowing why, she remembered. And in that remembering, he was near. That is how the fire spreads now, through story, through memory, through the humble kindling of hearts willing to be warmed. And I, old and broken, am a part of that kindling. My story is not needed to be known, only to be true. And it is true. I was there. I felt the hush when he breathed near. I felt the warmth when he stood still beside the ash. I felt the sky pause when he gave up his spirit. And I felt the veil turn not just in the temple, but in the world. Since then, I have heard 1,000 echoes of that moment in prisons turned to places of peace, in hospital beds made holy, in dinner tables filled with gratitude instead of food. The veil is still torn. The presence still spills into every crack that dares to remain open. I am one of those cracks, and gladly so. For what is brokenness if it lets the light in? They need not remember me. They only need to believe he remembers them. That is enough. That is fire. That is what keeps me alive, even buried, even forgotten. So if you, reader of silence, Ever wonder if the stories are true, if the fire still lives? Listen, not with ears, with longing, and you will hear what I once heard, the hush of holiness, the breath before grace, the whisper that does not pass away. They found me once, centuries after the silence, when digging the foundations of something new. I was nothing but a fragment, then a curve of stone, charred and worn, half swallowed by the earth. They did not know what I had been. They guessed a lamp base, a fragment of some ancient vessel, maybe part of a column, but they touched me gently, and for a moment, they paused. I felt it again, the breath, that ancient inhale before the soul remembers. I did not need them to name me. I had not been forgotten. The earth had held me, the silence had carried me, and the story had always been mine to cradle. The story of one who stepped into the temple, not to destroy, but to fulfill, who let himself be broken so all could be whole. I was only stone, but even I understood. Wholeness was never about perfection. It was about presence, and he was presence. Presence that could fill a room without speaking, presence that could calm storms and stir hearts and weep without shame. That's what I had carried, not fire, him. Even now, when they lift me up and place me in glass for scholars to examine, I do not feel exposed. I feel revealed, not for glory, for testimony, that I was there, that I saw, that I held the silence after God spoke with human breath. I do not envy the clean lines of modern altars or the polished brass of new sanctuaries. They are beautiful, but they have not been scorched. They have not held the weeping. I have. I was built not to shine, but to endure. And I have endured. Long after flames died down, long after songs were silenced, long after my form was forgotten, I remained. And now, as fingers brush my edge, and eyes try to understand what I once was, I speak in the only way I can, by presence. I am here, I am still here, and he is too. I remember the weight of sacrifice, just animals or offerings, but the sacrifice of hope. People came to me carrying what they dared not say aloud. They placed their grief in silence, their shame in gesture, and I received it all, not because I was worthy, but because I was still. That stillness made room for heaven to come near. They didn't know how to name it then, but I did. Emmanuel. There were mornings when dew gathered in my basin, like tears the stones could not cry, and evenings when shadows stretched long across my face, as if the day itself knelt in reverence. Now, as light filters through the museum glass, I feel none of that, yet somehow I feel everything. Because his story is not locked in time. It is carried by the ones who dare to remember. A child presses his nose to the glass and asks, "Did Jesus touch this?" And though no one answers, I feel a stirring, not pride, purpose. I was not an accident. I was prepared, formed, emptied, scorched, blessed, and now displayed. But not as a relic, as a witness, and in a world that forgets too quickly, witnesses matter. They remind us we were not alone, that God once walked among us, that ashes can hold grace, that silence can echo eternity. And maybe, just maybe, that the fire still burns not in me, but because of me, because I held him, because I remember, because I stayed. That is what I want the children to know. Not my name, not my age, but my knowing, my stillness, my enduring. I was not chosen because I was strong. I was chosen because I was empty. That's where the fire could rest. And so I say again, not aloud but through my being, he is here, still, now, in the room where this stone sits, in the heart that dares to hope, in the whisper of a name spoken not in confidence, but in desperation. He answers those whispers. He always has. Once, a woman sat near the display where I now rest. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking beyond into something only she could see. Perhaps a memory, perhaps a wound, perhaps a prayer too fragile for words. She didn't speak, but she stayed. Long after the others had moved on, long after the guide's voice faded, she stayed. And I knew she was not staying for me. She was staying for him. Because something in this silence felt familiar, sacred, known. That is the legacy of presence. It marks a place even after the feet have gone. It lingers where love has touched down. And I forgotten fragment, anonymous stone have become a map for that lingering. They may never rebuild the temple, but they build cathedrals of memory, sanctuaries of story, chapels of ache and wonder. And if I can be a single stone in that architecture of hope, then let it be so. I do not seek veneration. I seek only to point, to direct the wondering heart toward the one who still walks beside it. Let them touch this stone and ask no questions. Let them feel only the hush, the invitation, the trace of fire, and let them know he was here, and he is here, and he always will be. In the years to come, this fragment may be moved again, labeled, cleaned, even forgotten once more. But I do not fear obscurity. I was never meant to be known. I was meant to witness. And witness I did. I witnessed the holy become human, the divine bend low, the word breathe among the weary. That is what I hold, not an inscription. In essence, and if one day I crumble entirely, if time and touch wear me down to dust, let that dust bear the memory. Let it scatter into corners where love needs to bloom. Let it settle on shoulders, bowed in prayer. Let it line the souls of those who walk where he leads. Then I will not be lost. I will be sent, like the fire once was, like he once was, into the world, for love. This is the last of me, though not the least. I have told my story not with voice, but with presence, with memory, with the echo of a flame once housed within my hollow frame. I was not born of greatness. I was carved from common stone, shaped by hands long forgotten, placed not in the center, but along the edge, close enough to witness, quiet enough to be overlooked. And yet, that is where glory passed by. That is where God breathed near. I have learned this. Holiness favors the margins, the quiet, the empty, the broken, the waiting. Those are the places where fire settles gently, without spectacle. And I was one of those places, not because I was ready, but because I was open, because I did not turn away. The world has changed since then. Altars have shifted, temples have fallen, but the hunger remains. That hunger for presence, for peace, for a love that does not withdraw in darkness. I have nothing left to offer but this, my remembering, my bearing witness, my quiet ache that he would come again, not in thunder, but in touch, not in dominion, but in dwelling. And perhaps that is what he always intended, not to be worshipped from afar, but to be known, known in the breaking of bread, known in the washing of feet, known in the silence of those who stay. And I stayed. I stayed when the song stopped. I stayed when the fire went out. I stayed when the world moved on. And because I stayed, I remember. And because I remember, I still burn. I burn not with fire, but with witness. With the memory of his voice speaking truth so quietly the world had to still itself to hear. With the vision of his eyes meeting the broken and calling them beloved. I burn with the story of love made flesh, of God choosing dust, of heaven folded into a womb and born beside beasts. I burn with the understanding that no vessel is too low for glory, that cracked stones can cradle holiness, that ash can still reflect light. You who read this may never touch me. You may never know where I once stood. But you have stood where he stands, wherever love dares to stay, wherever forgiveness costs something, wherever the poor are lifted and the proud are softened. There he is, and there I am too, not for myself, for the story that begins not in fire, but in longing, and ends not in ruin, but in return. There are those who fear the silence that follows faith, who fear what remains when the fire dies down. I do not fear it. I lived there. I held it. I let it reshape me, and in the silence, I found something deeper than answers. Presence, not to fix, to fill, not to explain, to stay. And when he stayed, even the silence sang. I want you to know, he never left, not truly. The fire moved, yes, but it moved into flesh, into those who remember, into those who believe enough to wait. And when they gather, he is there, and so am I. For once a stone has burned, it never forgets the warmth. I was never the point, I was only the place, but the place was real, and the fire was true. And now, in your hands, the story continues. not written in stone but in heart, in deed, in tenderness. So when you love without reason, when you kneel without knowing why, when you choose mercy when vengeance feels easier, know that you are not alone. You are near the flame, and the flame knows your name, as it once knew mine. And if you should find yourself someday at the edge of belief, where prayers feel thin and the silence feels heavier than heaven, remember me, not for who I was, but for what I held. Remember that even shattered stones once cradled fire, that even dust remembers glory, that even forgotten places are not forsaken. He walked among us not to leave monuments, but memories, living memories, not kept in glass, but in breath, in the kindness that costs, in the faith that waits, in the love that lingers. I was just stone, but I held that love for a moment, and now I pass it to you, not in relic, but in remembering. Let your life be the new altar. Let your heart be the new basin. Not perfect, only willing, only open, and the fire will come. Not as before, as now, quiet, steady, holy, and that, at last, is all I need to say, for He is the Word, and I am only the echo, and the echo still sings, even in silence, especially there. Let the story go on, not because the past demands it, but because the future longs for it. Let the little ones grow up hearing of a God who bent low. Let the broken find shelter in memory. Let the proud be undone by love's gentleness. And if ever they ask, where was He? Let them answer not with place, but with presence. Let them point not to temples, but to tables, not to relics, but to restoration. And in that, I will be present, not as object, as offering. The offering of silence that once held the sacred, the offering of a vessel that dared to remain. And now, I rest, not in forgetting, in fulfillment, not as discarded, as complete. For the story has moved on, but not without me. It carries me, as it carries you, as it carries us all home.